Tonight we gather in a space of gentle quiet where the wisdom of countless generations meets this single moment. For thousands of years, seekers of peace have discovered that the rest we long for is not something we must earn or create. It lives within us already, patient and unchanging, waiting only for our recognition. Before we begin this journey together, you are welcome to share where you are listening from and what time it is in your world. There is no right way to receive these teachings. You might be lying in bed ready for sleep. You might be sitting quietly after a long day. Wherever you are, however you have arrived here, you are exactly where you need to be. These are not complicated lessons that require intense focus or perfect understanding. They are simple truths about the nature of awareness itself, about the peace that exists beneath all the noise and struggle of daily life. And as we explore these truths together through ancient stories and timeless wisdom, something natural begins to happen. The mind that has been racing all day starts to slow. The body that has been carrying tension begins to soften. We will walk together through teachings that have helped millions find their way back to peace. Not a peace that depends on perfect circumstances, but a peace that remains steady regardless of what is happening around us. This peace is your birthright. It has always been yours. Thank you for trusting this time to rest in awareness with us. Let us begin. The teachers of old discovered something remarkable about the nature of existence. They found that when we truly pay attention to life as it unfolds, we notice something that most people miss in their hurry and distraction. Everything that exists is constantly flowing, constantly changing, constantly becoming something new. This is not merely an interesting observation. It is a fundamental truth that, when deeply understood, has the power to set us free from so much unnecessary suffering. We live in a world of constant motion. The river flows. The seasons turn. Our bodies grow and age. Our thoughts arise and dissolve. Our feelings come and go, like weather moving across the sky. Nothing remains frozen in time. Not for even a single moment. Yet we spend enormous energy trying to make things stay the same. We find something we love and immediately begin to worry about losing it. We achieve something we wanted and instantly fear it will be taken away. We meet someone who brings us joy and cannot stop imagining the pain of separation. This resistance to change, this constant attempt to freeze the flowing river, creates a deep exhaustion in our hearts. But what if we could learn to trust the flow instead of fighting it? What if we could discover that change itself, rather than being our enemy, is actually the very force that keeps life fresh and alive and full of possibility? Let me share a story about a woman who discovered this truth in the most unexpected way. In the mountains of ancient China, there lived a potter named Mei, who had devoted her entire life to creating beautiful ceramics. Her workshop sat at the edge of a small village, and the smoke from her kiln could be seen rising into the sky every morning as she fired her latest creations. Mei had studied with her grandmother, who had studied with her own mother, learning techniques that had been passed down through 7 generations of master potters. Each piece she created was a work of meditation and skill. She would spend days preparing the clay, removing every imperfection, achieving exactly the right consistency. She would shape each vessel with hands that knew the ancient forms by heart. She would paint delicate designs that captured the beauty of nature in brush strokes so fine they seemed to breathe. But Mei's greatest pride was her glazes. She had spent 20 years perfecting a particular shade of blue that seemed to capture the color of the sky just before dawn. Collectors would travel for weeks just to acquire one of her blue vessels. Other potters tried to copy her technique, but none could match the luminous quality she achieved. This blue glaze had become her signature, her identity as an artist. People no longer spoke of Mei the potter. They spoke of Mei the creator of that extraordinary blue. One autumn, Mei was commissioned by a wealthy merchant to create a complete tea ceremony set. It would be the most important commission of her career, a set that would be passed down through the merchant's family for generations. May accepted the challenge with both excitement and pressure. She spent 3 months creating the pieces. Each cup, each bowl, each plate was shaped with absolute precision. The forms were flawless. The painting was her finest work, and when it came time to apply her famous blue glaze, she mixed it with even more care than usual. Knowing that this set would define her legacy, she loaded the pieces into her kiln, following the exact firing schedule she had perfected over 2 decades. The temperature had to be precise. The timing had to be exact. She stayed awake through the entire firing, adjusting the fuel, monitoring the heat, ensuring that everything proceeded according to her careful plans. When the kiln finally cooled and it was time to open it, May's hands trembled with anticipation. This would be her masterpiece, the culmination of everything she had learned. She carefully removed the first cup, and her heart stopped. The glaze was wrong. Instead of her signature luminous blue, the pieces had turned a strange green color she had never seen before. Every single piece in the set was affected. The green was not ugly exactly, but it was completely different from what she had intended. It was not what the merchant had paid for. It was not what her reputation was built upon. May felt the world collapsing around her. She checked everything obsessively. The glaze recipe had been followed exactly. The firing temperature had been perfect. The timing had been precise. There was no explanation for what had happened. Perhaps something in the wood she had used for fuel had contained unusual minerals. Perhaps the clay itself had contained some impurity she had not detected. The cause did not matter. What mattered was that her most important commission was ruined. She would have to tell the merchant that she had failed. Her reputation would be destroyed. The technique she had spent 20 years perfecting had betrayed her. That evening, as May sat in her workshop staring at the green pieces, her old friend Lin came to visit. Lin was a traveling tea master who had known May since childhood. She had commissioned many pieces for May over the years and understood both the art of pottery and the art of tea. When Lin saw the pieces, she did not gasp in horror as May expected. Instead, she picked up one of the cups and held it to the light, turning it slowly, examining the unexpected green glaze from every angle. "This color," Lin said softly, "is extraordinary. I have never seen anything like it. It looks like jade, but somehow alive, as if light is moving through it." May shook her head bitterly. "It is not what I intended. It is not my blue. The merchant commissioned a blue set. This is a failure." Lin set down the cup and looked at her friend with gentle eyes. "Tell me, when you shaped the clay, did you fight against its nature, or work with what it wanted to become?" "I worked with the clay," May said, confused by the question. "Of course. You cannot force clay to do what it does not want to do. And when you painted the designs, did you demand that the brush create exactly what was in your mind? Or did you allow each stroke to be what it needed to be in that moment?" May thought about this. "I suppose I allowed each stroke to happen naturally. I have learned that the most beautiful work comes when I do not grip the brush too tightly, when I let my hand move with wisdom rather than force." Lin nodded. "So you understand that the most beautiful things come from working with the natural flow rather than forcing predetermined outcomes. You trust the clay, you trust the brush, but you do not trust the fire. The fire had its own wisdom in this firing, May. It created something you could never have planned, something unique, something that has never existed before and may never exist again." May looked at the pieces with new eyes, trying to see what her friend was seeing. "But it is not what was ordered. It is not what I promised." "Perhaps," Lin said gently, "what actually emerged is more valuable than what was promised. The merchant commissioned a blue set because that is all he knew to ask for. He had never seen this green. He did not know it was possible. You have the chance to show him something beyond what he could imagine." Over the next few days, May struggled with her friend's words. Part of her wanted to smash all the pieces and start over, to recreate the blue set exactly as planned. But another part of her, the part that remembered her grandmother's teachings about trusting the process, began to wonder if Lynn might be right. She decided to show the set to the merchant before making any final decisions. When the merchant arrived and saw the pieces, May held her breath, waiting for his anger and disappointment. But the merchant stood perfectly still for a long moment, simply looking. Then he reached out and picked up one of the cups with a reverence that surprised May. "Master May," he said quietly, "I came expecting your famous blue, and I am certain that would have been beautiful. But this is something else entirely. This green seems to hold both earth and sky. It changes in different light. It feels alive in my hands." His eyes met hers, and she saw genuine wonder in his face. "I commissioned a tea set that would be beautiful. You have created a tea set that will be legendary. My family will tell the story of these pieces for generations, not just because they are beautiful, but because they are unlike anything else in the world." After the merchant left, deeply satisfied with his unique set, May sat alone in her workshop, holding one of the green cups. She realized that her attachment to the blue glaze had been subtle but profound. She had built her entire identity around it. She had believed that her value as an artist depended on being able to reproduce that exact color every time. But the fire had taught her something her grandmother's words had always pointed toward, but she had not fully understood. True mastery is not about controlling outcomes. It is about developing such deep skill that you can respond wisely to whatever emerges. May did not abandon her blue glaze. She continued to create pieces with that beautiful color, and people continued to treasure them. But she also became known for something else, for her willingness to trust the process, to work with accidents rather than be destroyed by them, to see unexpected results as opportunities rather than failures. Years later, students would travel to study with May, and she would tell them the story of the green tea set. "The piece I learned most from was the piece I did not plan," she would say. "The fire taught me that day that I could spend my whole life trying to control every detail, or I could develop such deep skill and trust that I could dance with whatever appeared. One approach leads to constant anxiety. The other leads to freedom and creativity that never runs dry." This story shows us something essential about the nature of change and our relationship to it. May had spent 20 years perfecting her technique, developing genuine skill and artistry. But her skill had become trapped by her attachment to specific outcomes. She had begun to believe that her value depended on being able to reproduce the same result every time. When the firing produced something completely different from her plan, she initially saw only disaster. Her mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios about her reputation and career. She had not yet learned to see change as anything but a threat to what she had carefully built. But Lynn helped her recognize something crucial. The same wisdom that had taught May to work with the clay rather than against it, to let each brush stroke be what it needed to be, could also apply to the unexpected results of firing. The fire had not betrayed her. It had simply demonstrated that reality is always more creative than our plans. This teaching about impermanence is not asking us to stop making plans or developing skills. May's 20 years of practice were not wasted. They gave her the foundation that allowed her to recognize quality when it appeared, even in unexpected form. Her skill allowed her to shape beautiful vessels. Her experience allowed her to prepare excellent glazes. But her real mastery came when she learned to hold her plans lightly enough that she could recognize when something even better had emerged. Most of us live like May before the green tea set. We develop ideas about how things should be, and then we spend tremendous energy trying to force reality to match our expectations. When circumstances change in ways we did not anticipate, we see only loss, only failure, only evidence that something has gone wrong. But what if we could learn to meet change the way a skilled dancer meets a new partner? The dancer has technique and training, but she does not try to force her partner to move in predetermined ways. She responds to what is actually happening, moment by moment, creating something beautiful through collaboration rather than control. The teaching of impermanence invites us to develop this kind of fluid skill in living, to become so grounded in our own awareness and capability that we can respond wisely to whatever appears, rather than rigidly insisting that life follow our script. Notice your breath right now. It flows in and out without asking your permission, constantly changing, never the same twice. This is not a problem to solve. It is the fundamental rhythm of being alive. May's transformation did not happen instantly. She struggled with disappointment and fear before she could see the gift the fire had given her. This is natural and human. We do not need to pretend that unexpected changes do not affect us, that losses do not hurt, that disappointments do not sting. But we can learn to make space for both the pain of change and the wisdom that sees beyond immediate disappointment. When May finally accepted what had emerged, rather than mourning what had been lost, she discovered freedom. She was no longer imprisoned by the need to reproduce exact results. She could trust her skill to respond creatively to whatever appeared. This kind of trust does not come from forcing ourselves to like every change. It comes from developing such deep capacity that we know we can work skillfully with whatever we encounter. Let me share another story that explores this teaching from a different angle, showing how our resistance to change often causes more suffering than the change itself. In a valley known for its orchards, there lived a farmer named Jun who had inherited land from his father and grandfather. For 40 years, Jun had grown apples in the same rows of trees that his grandfather had planted. The orchard was his life, his identity, his connection to his ancestors. Every spring he would tend the blossoms. Every autumn he would harvest the fruit. The rhythm of the seasons and the trees was the rhythm of his entire existence. Jun's apples were famous in the region. People said they were the sweetest apples they had ever tasted, with a perfect balance of crisp texture and rich flavor. Jun knew every tree in his orchard individually. He knew which ones produced the earliest fruit and which ones held their apples latest into autumn. He knew which trees needed extra water and which ones thrived with less attention. But Jun was growing old, and his body no longer had the strength to manage the orchard alone. His children had moved to the city for work, and none of them wanted to return to farming. Jun knew he would need to sell the orchard eventually, but he kept putting off the decision, unable to imagine his life without the trees that had defined it. Then, one terrible winter, a disease swept through the valley. It affected only apple trees, and it spread with devastating speed. Jun tried everything to save his orchard. He consulted with other farmers. He applied treatments. He worked from dawn to dusk, despite his aging body's protests. But the disease was relentless. One by one, his beloved trees sickened and died. By spring, every single tree in Jun's orchard was dead. 40 years of growth, generations of family history, all gone. Jun stood in the middle of what had been his thriving orchard, now just rows of dead trees, and felt that his own life had ended along with them. The other farmers in the valley expressed their sympathy, but they were busy trying to save their own orchards. Jun's neighbors suggested he plant new apple trees, but he knew that even fast-growing trees would take years to produce fruit, and he was already old. He would never see a mature orchard again in his lifetime. For weeks, Jun could do nothing but sit and stare at the dead trees. He had no purpose anymore. His identity as an apple farmer, as the keeper of his grandfather's legacy, had been destroyed. His wife, Hana, watched her husband sink deeper into despair. She tried to comfort him, but he seemed unreachable, lost in grief for what had been taken from him. One morning, Hana suggested they take a walk together, something they had not done in years because Jun had always been too busy with the orchard. They walked beyond their property, into areas Jun rarely visited because his entire world had revolved around his trees, As they walked, Jun noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The meadows beyond his orchard were covered in wildflowers. The hillsides were thick with herbs that filled the air with fragrance. The forest nearby held mushrooms and wild vegetables that his wife had sometimes gathered, but he had always ignored, too focused on his apples. Hana bent down and picked a handful of herbs. "Do you know what these are?" she asked her husband. Jun shook his head. "I never paid attention to anything but the apple trees." "These are medicinal herbs," Hana said. "People in the village buy them from traveling merchants for high prices. They grow wild here on land we own that you never used because it was not suitable for apples." As they continued walking, Hana pointed out plant after plant that had value. Herbs for medicine, flowers that could be dried and sold, mushrooms that were considered delicacies. The land that Jun had always seen as useless because it could not support apple trees was actually rich with other possibilities. "When we were young," Hana said carefully, "you made a choice to continue your father's orchard. It was a good choice. The apples brought us a stable life. But that choice also meant saying no to other possibilities. You inherited this land, but you only ever used the part that was suitable for apples." Jun listened in silence, beginning to see his land with new eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I am not suggesting anything," Hana replied. "I am only showing you what is already here. The apple trees are gone, and I know that loss breaks your heart. But the land remains, the soil is still fertile, the water still flows, and there are many plants that want to grow here besides apples." Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Jun began to explore his land as if for the first time. He started learning about the medicinal herbs that grew wild in his meadows. He discovered that the hillsides could support lavender, which thrived in soil that had been too rocky for fruit trees. He found that mushrooms could be cultivated in the shaded areas where apples would never have grown. With Hana's encouragement, Jun began what felt like a completely new life. He partnered with an herbalist from the village who taught him which plants had medicinal value and how to harvest them sustainably. He learned to cultivate mushrooms, a skill completely different from growing apples, but fascinating in its own way. He planted lavender on the hillsides, creating fields of purple that brought beauty and income. The work was different from what he had done for 40 years, but Jun discovered that his lifetime of understanding soil and seasons and plants transferred to these new crops. He was still a farmer. He was still working with the land his grandfather had left him. But he was no longer limited to the single identity of apple grower. Within 2 years, Jun's new farm was thriving in ways the apple orchard never had. The variety of crops meant that if one did poorly, others would balance it out. The medicinal herbs brought higher income than apples had. The lavender fields became so beautiful that people would visit just to walk through them, bringing unexpected revenue. One day, Jun stood on the hillside, looking down at his transformed land. Fields of lavender waved in the breeze. Herb gardens grew in neat rows. Mushroom houses stood where the oldest apple trees had been. It was beautiful in a completely different way than the orchard had been. His old friend Chen came to visit, amazed by the transformation. "Jun," Chen said, "I remember how destroyed you were when the disease took your apple trees. I worried you might never recover. But look at what you have created now." Jun nodded slowly. "I thought the death of the orchard was the death of my life's work. I thought everything I had built was destroyed. But Hana helped me see that I had never really looked at most of my land. I had been so focused on continuing my father's work that I never considered what else might be possible." He picked a stem of lavender and breathed in its scent. "The apple trees gave me 40 good years. I am grateful for that time. But they also kept me from seeing other possibilities. If they had not died, I would have continued growing only apples until I was too old to work at all. The disease felt like a curse, but it freed me to discover something new. I am doing work now that I find even more interesting than growing apples, and I am creating something unique rather than just maintaining what my father built. Years later, when young farmers would ask Jun for advice, he would tell them something surprising. Do not fall so in love with one way of doing things that you cannot see other possibilities. Your attachment to a particular path, even a good path, can become a prison that keeps you from discovering what else wants to grow through you. This story reveals another dimension of how our relationship with change creates either suffering or freedom. Jun's identity had become completely merged with his role as an apple farmer. When the disease destroyed his orchard, he initially experienced it as the destruction of himself, of his purpose, of his connection to his ancestors and his land. His grief was real and understandable. Losing something we have devoted our lives to creates genuine pain. But Jun's suffering was magnified by his belief that the only valuable use of his land was growing apples. This narrow view meant that he could not see the possibilities that had existed all along. The herbs, the flowers, the mushrooms had always been there. His wife had noticed them. But Jun had been so focused on maintaining what his father had done that he never looked at his land with fresh eyes. The disease forced a change that Jun would never have chosen. But that unwelcome change broke open his narrow definition of what was possible. It freed him from the weight of endlessly repeating the past. It gave him the opportunity to create something new, something that was his own rather than merely a continuation of tradition. This does not mean that tradition is bad or that honoring our ancestors is wrong. Jun had learned valuable skills during his 40 years of growing apples. His understanding of plants and seasons served him well in his new work. The problem was not that he grew apples. The problem was that he thought growing apples was the only way he could honor his land and his legacy. When we cling too tightly to any particular way of being, even a good way, we create rigidity in our lives. We become fragile, unable to adapt when circumstances inevitably change. But when we can hold our identities and our plans more loosely, when we remain curious about what else might be possible, we develop resilience. The teaching of impermanence is ultimately a teaching of freedom. It tells us that we are not trapped by our past, by our previous choices, by the identities we have constructed. Everything can change, which means we can change. Everything is flowing, which means we can flow with it rather than be broken by it. Jun discovered this freedom through loss, but we do not need to wait for disaster to learn this lesson. We can begin practicing right now in small ways by noticing where we might be gripping too tightly to particular outcomes, particular identities, particular ways of doing things. Feel the surface beneath you. It supports you without asking anything in return, just as life supports you through constant change without asking for your approval. Both Jun and Mei discovered that their greatest losses opened doors they had not known existed. The potter found a new green glaze that became legendary. The farmer found a new relationship with his land that brought more joy than the old one. Neither would have chosen the changes that came to them, but both learned to work creatively with what appeared rather than waste their energy fighting against reality. This is the first great teaching of resting in awareness. When we truly understand that everything changes, we stop exhausting ourselves trying to freeze time. We develop the flexibility to bend with the winds of change rather than be broken by them. We learn to see each ending not as pure loss, but as the necessary space in which something new can begin. The teachers of old observed something else about human experience, something that at first might seem discouraging, but ultimately opens the door to profound compassion. They noticed that life includes difficulty, disappointment, and pain as natural parts of the fabric of existence. This truth is not meant to make us pessimistic or depressed. It is meant to help us stop fighting against the reality of being human. When we accept that struggle is part of life, We can stop adding to our pain by judging ourselves for hurting or by believing something has gone wrong when we suffer. There is a great relief in this understanding. We do not have to pretend to be fine when we are not. We do not have to hide our struggles or feel ashamed of our difficulties. Everyone experiences pain. Everyone faces challenges. Everyone struggles sometimes. This is not a sign of weakness or failure. It is evidence of being alive. And here is the beautiful truth that the ancient teachers discovered. When we stop running from pain and instead meet it with gentle awareness, something remarkable happens. Our hearts naturally soften. We feel compassion arising, not as something we force ourselves to feel, but as the spontaneous response of a heart that truly understands. Let me share a story about how meeting difficulty with understanding rather than judgment can transform everything. In a village near the sea, and there lived a healer named Suma who had learned the art of medicine from her mother. She knew which herbs could ease pain, which roots could reduce fever, which leaves could heal wounds. People came from surrounding villages to seek her help, and she treated everyone who appeared at her door with equal care. Suma had a particular gift for sensing what was truly wrong with people, not just their physical symptoms, but the deeper pains they carried. She would listen carefully to their stories, and somehow she always seemed to know the right questions to ask, the right remedies to offer, the right words to speak. But Suma carried her own hidden pain that no one knew about. Years earlier, she had fallen deeply in love with a fisherman named Kenji. They had planned to marry, had spoken of the children they would have, the life they would build together. But 2 weeks before their wedding, Kenji's boat had gone out in what seemed like good weather. A sudden storm had appeared, and his boat never returned. Suma had stood on the shore for 3 days and nights, waiting, hoping, until finally she had to accept that he was gone. That was 10 years ago, but Suma had never fully recovered from the loss. She poured all her energy into her healing work, helping others, but never allowing herself to be vulnerable again. She kept her heart carefully guarded, never speaking of Kenji, never allowing anyone to see her grief. She believed that as a healer, she needed to be strong, to be the one who helped others rather than needing help herself. One autumn, a young woman named Yuki came to Suma's house. She was newly married, glowing with happiness, and she had come only for herbs to help with a minor ailment. But as Suma prepared the remedy, Yuki talked excitedly about her husband, a fisherman who had just returned from a successful trip. She spoke of how much she loved him, how happy she was, how they were planning to start a family. As Suma listened, something cracked open inside her chest. The carefully maintained walls around her heart suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Without warning, tears began streaming down her face. Yuki stopped talking, alarmed. "Healer Suma, what is wrong? Have I said something to upset you?" Suma tried to compose herself, embarrassed by this unexpected display of emotion in front of a patient. But the tears would not stop. Years of held grief came pouring out, and she found herself telling Yuki about Kenji, about the life that had been taken from her, about the loneliness she had carried in silence for a decade. Yuki listened with deep attention, her own eyes filling with tears. When Suma finally finished, exhausted by the release of so much held pain, Yuki reached out and took her hand. "You have carried this alone for so long," Yuki said softly. "You have spent 10 years helping others with their pain, but who has helped you with yours?" "No one," Suma admitted. "I thought I had to be strong. I thought a healer should not need healing." Yuki squeezed her hand gently. "But you are human, just like everyone who comes to your door. Your pain is just as real as theirs. Why should you have to carry it alone?" That simple question opened something in Suma that had been closed for years. She realized that she had been treating herself with harshness that she would never show to anyone else. She expected herself to be beyond needing support, beyond struggling with loss, beyond being human. Over the following weeks, Yuki visited Suma regularly, not as a patient, but as a friend. She encouraged Suma to talk about Kenji, to share memories instead of burying them. She helped Suma see that honoring her grief did not mean she was weak. It meant she had loved deeply, and that love still mattered. Something began to shift in Suma's healing work as well. She had always been skilled and caring, but now a new quality entered her interactions with patients. Because she had finally acknowledged her own pain, she could meet others suffering with even deeper understanding. When people came to her carrying not just physical ailments but emotional wounds, she no longer tried to simply fix them quickly. She made space for their whole experience, including their fear and sadness and confusion. One day, a middle-aged man named Taro came to her, complaining of pains in his chest that no physical remedy had helped. As Suma examined him, she sensed something beneath the physical symptoms. She set down her herbs and looked at him directly. "Tell me," she said gently, "what happened that you have not been able to speak about?" Taro looked startled, then his face crumpled. His son had died 2 years earlier in an accident, and he had never allowed himself to properly grieve. He had told himself that he needed to be strong for his wife, that men do not cry, that he should just push through the pain. But his body had been carrying what his heart refused to feel. Suma listened as Taro poured out his grief. She did not try to stop his tears or tell him everything would be fine. She simply sat with him, present and accepting, as he finally gave himself permission to feel what he had been suppressing. When he finished, Taro looked at her with wonder. "How did you know?" "I have been to other healers, but no one saw what was really wrong." Suma smiled sadly. "I know because I also tried to bury my grief. I also thought I had to be strong. But pain that is not acknowledged does not disappear. It just goes underground and causes different problems." She prepared herbs that would help with the physical symptoms, but she also gave him something else: permission to grieve, assurance that his pain was natural and human. Understanding that strength sometimes means allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. That evening, as Suma sat alone in her small house, she reflected on how much had changed since Yuki's visit. She had spent 10 years believing that her role as a healer meant she had to be invulnerable, but she had discovered that her own experience of pain, once she stopped running from it, had actually made her a better healer. Her willingness to acknowledge her own struggle had opened a door through which genuine compassion could flow. Years later, Suma became known not just for her medical skill, but for the quality of presence she brought to suffering. People said that simply being with her somehow made pain more bearable. They did not know that her gift came from her own hard-won wisdom, her own journey from running away from pain to meeting it with gentle acceptance. This story shows us something essential about the second great teaching. Suma was genuinely skilled at healing physical ailments, but she had disconnected from her own emotional pain. She thought that being a healer meant being above suffering, being the strong one who helps others without needing help herself. This belief created a subtle hardness in her heart. She cared for her patients, but there was a quality of distance, of separation between the healer who was strong and the patients who were weak. When her carefully maintained defenses finally cracked and she allowed herself to feel and express her grief, something transformed. By accepting her own pain rather than judging it as weakness, she developed genuine compassion for herself. And this self-compassion naturally extended to how she met others suffering. The teaching about suffering and compassion is not asking us to seek out pain or to believe that life is only suffering. It is asking us to stop adding extra layers of suffering by judging and resisting the pain that naturally arises in human life. Suma's grief about losing Kenji was natural and appropriate. She had loved deeply. Her heart was broken by real loss. The problem was not that she felt grief. The problem was that she judged herself for it, suppressed it, believed she should be beyond it. This judgment and suppression created additional suffering beyond the original pain. When we can meet our own difficulties with the same kindness we would offer to a dear friend, we discover something liberating. The pain does not necessarily disappear, but our relationship to it changes. We are no longer at war with ourselves. We are no longer spending energy trying to pretend we are fine when we are not. Notice any tension you might be holding in your body right now. Can you soften around it rather than fighting against it? This same kindness we learn to offer ourselves naturally flows outward to others. Suma's own experience of hidden pain and its release allowed her to see beneath Tero's physical symptoms to the emotional wound he was carrying. She recognized in him what she had recognized in herself, the harmful pattern of trying to be strong by denying pain. Her compassion for him was not a technique she had learned or a professional skill she performed. It arose naturally from her own direct understanding of what it feels like to carry hidden grief. Let me share another story that explores how compassion transforms not just our inner experience, but our relationships with others, especially those who have caused us harm. In a town known for its skilled weavers, there lived a woman named Aiko who had inherited her grandmother's loom and spent her days creating beautiful cloth. Her work was exquisite, with intricate patterns that required months of careful weaving to complete. She took pride in never making mistakes, in creating perfection with every piece. Aiko had an apprentice named Hiro, a young man who had begged for years to learn from her. She had finally accepted him into her workshop, though she was known for being demanding and difficult to please. Hiro tried his best to learn, but Aiko's standards were impossibly high. Nothing he did satisfied her. She would point out every tiny flaw, every small imperfection. She never offered praise, only criticism. One day, Aiko was commissioned to create a ceremonial cloth for an important temple. It would be her most significant work, a piece that would hang in the temple for generations. She spent weeks preparing, and when she was ready to begin the most intricate section, she asked Hiro to prepare the threads she would need. It was a simple task, but crucial. The threads needed to be wound onto bobbins in a very specific way. Hiro had done this task many times before and believed he knew how to do it correctly. But this time, nervous about the importance of the piece his teacher was creating, he made an error. He wound the threads in the opposite direction of what was needed. Aiko did not discover the mistake until she had already woven an entire section of the cloth using the incorrectly prepared threads. When she realized what had happened, she felt rage rising in her chest. Weeks of work were ruined. The cloth would have to be completely unwoven and started again. The deadline she had promised the temple was now impossible to meet. She turned to Hiro, ready to unleash her anger, to tell him he was useless, to throw him out of her workshop. But as she looked at his face, pale with fear and shame, something stopped her. She saw herself reflected in his expression. She remembered her own early years as an apprentice, the mistakes she had made, the crushing criticism she had received from her own teacher. She remembered how that harsh treatment had affected her, how it had made her afraid to take risks, afraid to be creative, afraid to be anything less than perfect. In that moment, Aiko realized that she had become exactly like the teacher who had made her life miserable. She had vowed as a young woman never to treat an apprentice the way she had been treated, but without awareness, she had repeated the same harmful patterns. She looked at Hiro's trembling hands and understood that behind his mistake was not carelessness, but anxiety created by her own impossible standards. The anger she had been about to release transformed into something else. She took a slow breath and spoke in a voice that surprised both of them with its gentleness. "Hiro, sit down." The young man sat, waiting for the punishment he knew he deserved. But instead of criticism, Aiko began to speak about her own early mistakes, stories she had never shared with anyone. She told him about the time she had ruined an entire bolt of silk because she had been too nervous to ask a question. She described the shame she had felt, the harsh words her teacher had said, and how those words had stayed with her for years, making her doubt herself even as her skill grew. "I spent my whole life trying to be perfect," Aiko said quietly, "because I believed that that was the only way to prove I was worthy. But perfection is a prison hero. It makes us afraid to try anything new. It makes us harsh with ourselves and harsh with others. Your mistake on this cloth is painful. It will cost time and effort to fix. But it has shown me something more important than any piece of weaving. It has shown me that I have been teaching you with fear rather than with love." Hiro looked up, tears in his eyes. "I am so sorry, Master Aiko. I will understand if you send me away." Aiko shook her head. "When my teacher found mistakes in my work, she would punish me and tell me I would never be good enough. That treatment did not make me a better weaver. It just made me afraid. I do not want to pass that fear on to you." She stood and walked to the loom where the ruined section of cloth hung. "Look at this mistake," she said. "Yes, the threads are wrong. But the pattern you can see here shows me something interesting. The error created an unexpected texture that might actually be beautiful if we developed it intentionally. What if, instead of simply fixing this and trying to pretend it never happened, we learned from it? What if we used this mistake to discover a new technique?" Over the following weeks, Aiko and Hiro worked together in a completely new way. Instead of Aiko demanding perfection and Hiro trying fearfully to meet impossible standards, they collaborated as partners. They experimented with the unexpected texture the mistake had created, and they discovered a new weaving technique that neither of them would have thought to try intentionally. The cloth they eventually completed for the temple was unlike anything Aiko had ever made before. It incorporated both traditional perfection and beautiful mistakes that added depth and interest to the pattern. The monks who commissioned it were amazed. "This is extraordinary," the head monk said. "It has technical mastery, but it also has something alive in it, something that touches the heart rather than just impressing the eye." After the cloth was delivered, Hiro found the courage to speak to his teacher about the change in her. "Master Aiko," he said respectfully, "you are different now since that day when I made the mistake with the threads. You are still skilled and still teach me rigorously, but you are kinder." "What changed?" Aiko thought carefully about her answer. "I saw myself in your frightened face, and I remembered my own suffering under harsh teaching. In that moment, I had a choice. I could repeat the cruelty that had been done to me, or I could break that cycle." She picked up a shuttle and ran her fingers over its smooth wood. "For years I believed that being demanding and critical made me a good teacher. But I was confusing fear with respect, compliance with learning. When I finally allowed myself to feel compassion for the young apprentice I had been, that compassion naturally extended to you. I realized that you were not my enemy to be conquered or controlled. You were a young person trying to learn, just as I had been. And you deserved the kindness I had always wished someone had shown me." From that day forward, Aiko's workshop became known not just for the quality of the cloth produced there, but for the way apprentices were treated with respect and patience. Other master weavers would ask Aiko how she got such good work from her students, and she would say something that puzzled them. "I stopped trying to eliminate their mistakes and started helping them learn from them. I stopped demanding they be perfect and started allowing them to be human. The cloth we create now has both mastery and heart because it comes from a workshop where people are not afraid." Years later, Hiro became a master weaver himself and opened his own workshop. He remembered the harsh Aiko he had first studied with and the transformed Aiko who had shown him compassion. When his own apprentices made mistakes, he thought of that pivotal day when his error had become a teacher for both him and his master. He treated his students the way Aiko had learned to treat him, with high standards, but also with understanding, with demands for excellence, but also with recognition that learning requires the freedom to fail. One day, Many years after Aiko had passed away, Hiro visited the temple where their collaborative cloth still hung. He stood before it, remembering the mistake that had created it, remembering his teacher's anger transforming into compassion, remembering how that single moment had changed both of their lives. A young monk standing nearby noticed his attention to the cloth. "It is beautiful, is it not?" the monk said. The master who created it was known for perfection, but this piece has something more than perfection. It has wisdom? Hiro smiled. "Yes," he said, "it has wisdom. It was created the day my teacher learned that compassion is more powerful than control, and that our mistakes can become our greatest teachers if we meet them with understanding rather than judgment." This story reveals another dimension of how compassion transforms our experience and our relationships. Aiko's anger at Hiro's mistake was understandable. He had made an error that created real consequences. The work would need to be redone. Time and materials were lost. But Aiko's moment of recognition, when she saw herself reflected in Hiro's fear, changed everything. Instead of simply reacting from anger, she paused long enough to remember her own experience of being an apprentice. This remembering opened a door to compassion. She could feel not just her own frustration, but also Hiro's fear and shame. She could see how her harsh treatment had created the very anxiety that led to his mistake. Most importantly, she recognized that she had a choice. She could repeat the cycle of harshness that had been inflicted on her, or she could choose something different. This is the transformative power of compassion. When we can see that the person who has harmed or disappointed us is also suffering, is also struggling, is also human, something softens in us. This does not mean we excuse harmful behavior or pretend that mistakes do not matter. Aiko did not tell Hiro that his error was fine or unimportant, but she also did not use his mistake as an excuse to diminish or attack him. She met the situation with both clarity about what had happened and kindness toward the human being who had made the error. Notice how you are breathing right now without trying to control it. This is how compassion works, naturally, when we stop forcing and simply allow understanding to arise. The unexpected beauty of this story is how Aiko's compassion led to creative discovery. If she had simply punished Hiro and forced him to fix the mistake exactly according to the original plan, they would have created the cloth as intended. It would have been technically perfect, but unchanged by the experience. Instead, by exploring what the mistake had created, rather than just eliminating it, they discovered something new, a technique that added unexpected beauty to the finished work. This teaches us something profound about how we can meet not just mistakes, but all difficulties in life. When we approach problems with rigid demands for how things should be, we miss opportunities for unexpected discovery. But when we bring curiosity and compassion to difficulties, asking, "What can we learn from this?" rather than just, "How do we make it go away?" we open possibilities we could never have planned. Aiko's transformation also affected everyone around her. Her workshop became a place where apprentices could learn without constant fear. The cloth they created had something alive in it because it came from a place where people were allowed to be human. Fear might produce compliant behavior, but it does not produce genuine creativity or the kind of work that touches the heart. This teaching extends into every corner of our lives. How we meet our own mistakes and struggles affects how we meet others' mistakes and struggles. When we are harsh with ourselves, we tend to be harsh with others. When we can hold our own imperfections with kindness, we naturally extend that kindness outward. Hiro eventually becoming a teacher himself and passing on the compassion he received shows us how these patterns ripple through time. The harshness that Aiko had received from her teacher could have continued through her to Hiro and through him to his students, on and on through generations. But Aiko's moment of recognition broke that cycle. Her choice to respond with compassion rather than cruelty changed not just one interaction, but potentially countless future ones. The cloth hanging in the temple years later, still touching people's hearts, stands as a testament to what becomes possible when we choose understanding over judgment. It was literally created from a mistake, met with compassion, and it carried that quality of heart in its very fibers. This is the second great teaching of resting in awareness. Life includes difficulty, pain, and imperfection. This is not a flaw in existence, but an inherent part of being alive in these temporary, vulnerable human forms. When we stop fighting against this truth and instead meet it with compassionate awareness, we discover that our tender, vulnerable hearts are also our wise, strong hearts. The very sensitivity that allows us to be hurt is the same sensitivity that allows us to truly see and care for others. The ancient teachers observed something else about existence that can be difficult to understand at first, but incredibly freeing once we truly see it. They noticed that the separate, solid self we believe ourselves to be is not quite what we think it is. This teaching is sometimes called no self, but that phrase can sound frightening, as if we are being asked to disappear or become nothing. What this teaching actually points to is much gentler and more liberating. It suggests that the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the world, between who we think we are and who we think we are not, are more fluid and open than we realize. We spend enormous energy maintaining a particular sense of self, defending our identity, proving our worth, living up to the story we believe about who we are. But what if this story is not the deepest truth? What if the awareness that is reading these words right now is not limited to the narrow definitions we have constructed? Let me share a story about someone who discovered this truth through the simplest of circumstances. In a mountain village, accessible only by steep paths, there lived a woman named Keiko, who served as the village record keeper. It was her job to maintain all written documents, to record births and deaths, to preserve the history and agreements of the community. She had held this position for 30 years, having inherited it from her father, who had inherited it from his mother. Keiko took her role very seriously. She saw herself as the guardian of the village's memory, the one who ensured that nothing important was forgotten. She kept the records in perfect order. She could locate any document within moments. She knew every family's history, every boundary line between properties, every agreement made over decades. The village respected Keiko and relied on her completely. When disputes arose about land or inheritance, her records provided the answers. When people wanted to know about their ancestors, she could tell them stories going back generations. She was valued and important, and her entire identity was built around this role. But Keiko had a secret that troubled her deeply. She was beginning to forget things. Small things at first, a name she should have known, a detail about a family's history. She would cover these lapses, finding ways to hide her increasing confusion. She told no one, terrified that if anyone discovered she was losing her memory, she would lose her position, and with it, her entire sense of who she was. The forgetting grew worse. Some mornings, she would wake up unsure of where she was. She would look at documents she had written herself and not remember creating them. She began to fear that she was losing her mind, that the one thing that defined her, her reliable memory, was abandoning her. One spring day, a traveling merchant named Sato arrived in the village. He was an elderly man who had spent his life moving from place to place, trading goods and stories. He requested to see the record keeper to register his temporary stay, and Keiko received him in her small office surrounded by shelves of carefully organized documents. As they spoke, something about Sato's calm presence made Keiko feel safe enough to let her guard down. When he asked her a question about village history, and she could not remember the answer, she did not try to hide her confusion. She simply admitted, "I should know this, but I cannot recall it." To her surprise, Sato did not seem concerned or judgmental. He looked at her with kind eyes and said something unexpected. "Tell me, who are you when you are not the record keeper?" Keiko was startled by the question. I am the record keeper. That is who I am. That is what I do. But who are you before that role? Who were you before you inherited this position? Who will you be if you must leave it? Keiko had no answer. She had been the record keeper for so long that she could not imagine herself as anything else. The role had become completely merged with her sense of self. Sato settled into his chair as if he had all the time in the world. May I tell you something I learned in my years of traveling? He asked. Keiko nodded, grateful for this stranger's willingness to sit with her confusion. I have been many things in my life, Sato began. I was a son, then an orphan when my parents died. I was a soldier, then a farmer when the war ended. I was a husband, then a widower when my wife passed. I was a father, then alone when my children grew and left. I have been a merchant, a teacher, a wanderer. Each time I thought one of these roles defined who I was, life showed me that I was something more than that role. He leaned forward slightly. When I lost each identity, I thought I was losing myself. But what I actually discovered was that the self I had been protecting was just a story, a collection of roles and memories and ideas. Beneath all of those temporary identities was something that never changed, a simple awareness that witnessed everything, that was present through all the different roles, that remained even when the stories changed. Keiko listened, feeling tears forming in her eyes. But if I am not the record keeper, if my memory is failing and I cannot do my work, then what am I? You are the awareness that knows you are confused, Sato said gently. You are the consciousness that worries about forgetting. You are the being that is having this conversation with me right now. None of that requires you to be the record keeper. None of that depends on your memory being perfect. The awareness that you truly are has been here your whole life, before you became the record keeper, throughout your time in that role, and it will remain regardless of whether you continue in that position. Over the following days, Sato visited Keiko often. They would sit together, and he would ask her questions that helped her look beyond the role she had clung to. He encouraged her to notice the awareness that was present, regardless of what she could or could not remember. Gradually, something began to shift in Keiko's experience. She started to recognize that there was a difference between the roles she played and the fundamental awareness that witnessed those roles. When she forgot a detail, she noticed that there was still awareness present, knowing that forgetting was happening. When she felt fear about losing her identity, she noticed there was awareness of the fear. This awareness itself never forgot anything because it was not made of memories. It was simply present, simply aware, simply here. Eventually, Keiko found the courage to speak with the village elders about her memory problems. To her surprise, they were not angry or disappointed. They had already noticed her struggles and had been worried about her. They suggested that she train someone younger to take over her duties while she remained as an advisor, sharing what she still knew without bearing the full weight of responsibility. Keiko agreed, and as she began teaching a young woman named Hana to be the new record keeper, something unexpected happened. She discovered that she enjoyed teaching more than she had enjoyed maintaining the records. She found that even when she could not remember specific details, she could share wisdom about how to approach the work, how to serve the village, how to stay organized and clear. She was contributing in a new way, teaching not from perfect memory, but from deep understanding. One evening, Sato prepared to leave the village and continue his travels. Keiko came to say goodbye, and she thanked him for the gift he had given her. You helped me see that I am not just the record keeper, she said. You showed me that awareness itself is who I really am, and that awareness does not depend on any particular role or ability. Sato smiled. You discovered that yourself. I only asked questions that pointed you toward what was already true. Now you know that you can lose your memory, lose your role, lose everything you thought defined you, and still, awareness remains. Still, you're here. Still, life continues. After Sato left, Keiko continued in her new role as advisor and teacher. She watched as Hana became an excellent record keeper, perhaps even better than Keiko had been. Instead of feeling threatened by being replaced, Keiko felt peaceful. She had learned that her value as a human being did not depend on being the best at a particular job or maintaining a particular identity. Years later, when Keiko's memory had faded even more and she could no longer work at all, she would sit in the village square and simply watch life happening around her. People who passed by might have thought she was lost in confusion, but Keiko had found something more valuable than memory. She had found the peace of resting in awareness itself, not needing to be anybody special, not needing to prove anything, simply present and aware, simply here. This story shows us something beautiful about the teaching of no separate self. Keiko's entire identity was built around her role as record keeper. When that identity began to crumble because of her failing memory, she initially experienced it as the loss of herself. But Sato helped her discover something crucial. The roles we play, the stories we tell about who we are, the identities we construct, these are all temporary and changeable. Beneath them is something more fundamental, the simple awareness that experiences everything. This awareness does not need to be anybody special. It does not require any particular role or achievement to be valid. It is simply here, present, aware, regardless of what is happening. When Keiko discovered this, she found freedom from the prison of her constructed identity. She no longer needed to hide her struggles or defend her position. She could let the role go gracefully and discover that she still existed, still had value, still had something to offer. The teaching of no self is not saying that we do not exist. It is saying that what we truly are is more spacious and free than the narrow identities we cling to. We are not just our roles, our achievements, our memories, our stories about ourselves. We are the awareness in which all of these things appear and disappear. This understanding brings profound relief because it means we do not have to work so hard to maintain a particular self-image. We do not have to prove we are worthy or special or important. The awareness that we truly are is already complete, already valuable, already here, not because of anything we have done or achieved, but simply because awareness is the nature of being alive. Feel how you know you are here right now. This knowing does not depend on any story about who you are. It is simply present, simply aware. Let me share another story that explores this teaching from a different angle, showing how releasing our grip on fixed identity can open us to unexpected possibilities. In a city known for its scholarship, there lived a teacher named Daisuke who had spent 40 years studying and teaching philosophy at a prestigious academy. He had written numerous books, earned great respect, and was considered one of the finest minds in his field. Students competed for the opportunity to study with him, and other scholars sought his opinions on complex questions. Daisuke had built his entire life around his identity as an intellectual. He prided himself on his ability to analyze any question, to see all sides of an argument, to think with clarity and precision. He spoke eloquently, wrote beautifully, and impressed everyone with the depth of his knowledge. But as Daisuke entered his 60s, something began to trouble him. Despite all his learning, despite all his intellectual understanding, he felt a hollowness inside. He could explain every philosophical system, but he had not found the peace that philosophy promised. He could teach others about wisdom, but he did not feel truly wise himself. He began to feel like a fraud, standing before students and speaking about truths he had only understood intellectually, but never embodied. The disconnect between his role as a teacher of wisdom and his inner experience of confusion and restlessness grew wider. One summer, Daisuke decided to take a leave from the academy. He told his colleagues he needed time for research, but truthfully, he needed to escape the weight of pretending to be wiser than he felt. He traveled to a small mountain monastery he had heard about. hoping that some time in quiet contemplation might help him find what was missing. The monastery was simple and spare, nothing like the comfortable academy he was used to. The monks spent their days in meditation, work, and silence. There were no elaborate philosophical discussions, no intellectual debates, just simple practice. Daisuke was assigned to work in the monastery kitchen under the supervision of an old monk named Goro, who managed the cooking and cleaning. Goro could barely read, had never studied philosophy, and seemed to spend his entire life simply washing vegetables, preparing simple meals, and cleaning dishes. At first, Daisuke felt insulted by this assignment. He was a renowned scholar, and here he was being asked to chop vegetables under the direction of an illiterate old monk. But he had come seeking something, so he tried to humble himself and do the work. As he worked alongside Goro, Daisuke noticed something puzzling. The old monk moved through his tasks with complete attention and what appeared to be genuine contentment. He washed each dish as if it were the most important thing in the world. He chopped vegetables with care and precision. He swept the floor as though performing a sacred ceremony. One day, after watching Goro clean the same counter for the third time with the same focused attention, Daisuke could not contain his curiosity. "Honored brother," he said, "do you not find this work tedious? Day after day, the same simple tasks, never anything new or interesting?" Goro paused in his work and looked at Daisuke with eyes that held surprising depth. "Tedious?" he repeated, as if trying to understand the word. "Each moment is completely new. This counter has never been exactly this dirty before. My hand moves differently each time. The light from the window changes throughout the day. How could it be tedious when everything is always fresh?" Daisuke was struck by this response. Here was a perspective he had never encountered in all his philosophical studies. "But surely," he pressed, "you must wish you could do something more significant, more meaningful than washing dishes and sweeping floors." Goro smiled gently. "What could be more significant than caring for the space where our community gathers to eat? What could be more meaningful than ensuring that the dishes are clean and the food is prepared with attention? No batikst. When I wash a dish, I am fully washing a dish. That is everything." Over the following weeks, Daisuke found himself watching Goro more closely. He began to notice that the old monk's simplicity held something his own complexity had missed. Goro did not spend time thinking about whether he was doing important work. He simply did the work completely. He did not worry about his identity or reputation. He simply showed up fully for each task. One afternoon, as they worked together preparing vegetables for the evening meal, Daisuke decided to share his struggle. "Brother Goro," he said quietly, "may I confess something? I am a teacher of philosophy at a great academy. I have spent my life studying wisdom, but I feel empty inside. I can talk about truth, but I do not feel I truly know it. I fear I am a fraud, pretending to be wise when I am actually lost." Goro continued cutting vegetables, his knife moving in a steady rhythm. "What do you think wisdom is?" he asked. "Understanding the nature of reality," Daisuke answered immediately. "Knowing truth, seeing clearly." "And do you not see these carrots clearly?" Goro held up a carrot. "Is this not real? Is the weight of this knife in my hand not true?" "Well, yes," Daisuke said, "but that is just ordinary perception. I am talking about deeper wisdom." Goro laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. "My friend, I think perhaps you have made wisdom into something complicated and far away, something that requires special understanding that ordinary people cannot reach. But what if wisdom is simply this? Simply being fully present for what is actually here." He gestured around the kitchen. "When I wash dishes, I am not thinking about wisdom. I am washing dishes. My hands feel the water. I see the soap bubbles. I notice the dish becoming clean. All of my attention is here, not scattered into past or future, not lost in thoughts about who I am or what I should be doing. Is this not seeing clearly? Is this not knowing truth? Daisuke felt something shift inside him. But anyone can wash dishes with attention. That is not special. Exactly, Goro said with obvious delight. Anyone can do it. But how many actually do? You have spent 40 years studying what wisdom is, but have you spent 40 years practicing simply being present for ordinary life? You have learned to think about truth, but have you learned to live it in each simple moment? That evening, as Daisuke sat in meditation with the other monks, he let his elaborate thoughts about wisdom fall away. Instead of trying to achieve some special state or understand some profound truth, he simply sat. He felt his breath. He heard the sounds around him. He noticed thoughts arising and dissolving. It was ordinary, simple, nothing special. And yet, there was something in it, a quality of peace he had never found in all his intellectual searching. Over the remaining months of his stay, Daisuke began to learn what Goro was teaching through his simple presence. He learned that being fully present for washing dishes was actually harder than analyzing philosophical texts. The mind wanted to wander, to think about more important things, to maintain his identity as an intellectual who was above such simple work. But gradually, he began to find a strange satisfaction in the simplicity. When he washed dishes, he just washed dishes. When he swept floors, he just swept floors. When he chopped vegetables, he just chopped vegetables. And in those moments of complete presence, the hollowness inside him began to fill with something he had never known, a sense of being enough, just as he was, without needing to be a great scholar or teacher. When it came time for Daisuke to return to the academy, he went to thank Goro for his teaching. "You have given me what 40 years of philosophy could not," he said. "You have shown me that wisdom is not something to achieve or understand. It is simply being fully present for this moment, whatever this moment contains." Goro bowed with characteristic humility. "You already knew this," he said. "You just forgot it beneath all your learning. Every baby knows how to be fully present. Every dog knows how to be completely here. You had to learn many complicated things that covered up this simple knowing. Now you can return to your teaching, but perhaps you will teach differently." Daisuke did return to the academy, and his teaching changed completely. He still shared philosophical concepts, but he also taught his students about presence, about the wisdom of simple attention, about the difference between knowing about something and actually knowing it directly. His most memorable lesson came each semester when he would spend an entire class session washing a single bowl in front of his students. He would wash it slowly, attentively, completely present for the simple act. Then he would look at his confused students and say, "I have just demonstrated the most profound wisdom teaching I know. Did you see it?" Most students did not understand at first. They wanted complex explanations, sophisticated theories, but a few would begin to grasp what he was showing them, that wisdom is not found in complicated understanding, but in simple presence, not in knowing about life, but in being fully alive in each moment. Years later, when asked about his time at the monastery, Daisuke would say, "I went there as a great scholar seeking something I had lost. I returned as a simple person who had found what was never lost. I thought I needed to become someone wiser, but I only needed to stop pretending to be anyone at all and simply be present for what is actually here." This story reveals another aspect of the teaching about no self. Daisuke had built his entire identity around being an intellectual, a scholar, a teacher of profound wisdom. This identity was not false exactly. It was based on real achievement and genuine learning, but it had become a prison that kept him from the actual experience of wisdom. Goro, who could barely read and had no intellectual training, embodied wisdom through his complete presence for simple tasks. He did not think of himself as wise or special. He was simply fully here for washing dishes, chopping vegetables, sweeping floors. This simple presence, this complete engagement with ordinary life, held more genuine wisdom than all of Daisuke's sophisticated understanding. The teaching here is subtle but profound. We often believe that becoming someone special, achieving something significant, developing impressive abilities, these things will finally make us feel complete and valuable. But what if the completeness we seek is actually found by releasing our grip on being anyone special at all? Daisuke discovered that his identity as a great scholar, while impressive to others, was actually weighing him down. It created constant pressure to maintain that image, to always be profound, to never be ordinary. When he learned to simply be present for washing dishes without needing it to be sophisticated or impressive, he found a peace his scholarship had never provided. This does not mean we should not develop skills or learn or grow. Daisuke's years of study had value, but they only became truly valuable when he stopped using them to construct and defend a special identity, and instead simply used them in service of being present and helpful. The teaching of no self is pointing to this freedom. When we are not trapped in defending and maintaining a particular identity, when we can be nobody special, we discover a spaciousness and ease that is always available. We can do sophisticated work or simple work with equal presence. We can be a scholar or a dishwasher with equal peace, because we recognize that what we truly are is not defined by these roles, but is the awareness that can be present for any role. Goro washing dishes with complete attention was not trying to be wise. He was simply there, fully, for the task at hand. This simple presence is the wisdom that Daisuke had been seeking in complicated philosophy. It was always available, in each moment, requiring nothing but the willingness to actually be here rather than lost in thoughts about who we are or what we should be doing. Notice right now that you are aware of these words. This awareness is not your thoughts about who you are. It is simply present, simply knowing, simply here. This is what both Goro and Daisuke discovered, that beneath all our roles and identities and stories is simple awareness, and that awareness is already free, already at peace, already complete. The third great teaching of resting in awareness is this: you are not trapped in the narrow definitions you have constructed about who you are. You are the spacious awareness in which all definitions appear. And this awareness is naturally free because it does not depend on any particular identity or achievement. It is simply here, simply aware, simply the nature of being conscious in this moment. The teachers of old emphasized something that might seem obvious but is actually easily forgotten in the rush of daily life. They taught that this moment, this very breath, this present awareness is the only place where life actually happens. Everything else, all our memories of the past and imaginings of the future, exists only as thoughts arising in this moment. Yet we spend most of our lives anywhere but here, lost in thoughts about yesterday or tomorrow, barely present for the only time that actually exists. This teaching about presence is not complicated, but it is profound. When we are fully here, fully awake to this moment as it actually is, we discover something remarkable. The peace we seek, the completeness we long for, the sense of being truly alive, all of it is available right now. Not in some future moment, after we have achieved certain goals or resolved certain problems. Here. Now, in the simple fact of being aware, let me share a story about someone who discovered this truth through circumstances that forced them to stop running toward the future and start noticing what was actually present. In a village built along a river, there lived a fisherman named Takeshi, who was known for his relentless ambition. He was never satisfied with what he had. Each season, He would set goals for how many fish he wanted to catch, how much money he wanted to earn, how much he wanted to expand his operation. He worked from before dawn until after dark, always pushing, always striving, always focused on the next goal. Takeshi had apprentices who helped him, and he drove them as hard as he drove himself. Faster, he would say. More efficiently. There's no time to waste. He saw every moment as something to be used productively toward achieving his goals. His wife, Yumi, would sometimes try to get him to slow down, to enjoy a meal together, to notice the beauty of the sunset over the river. But Takeshi had no patience for such things. I will rest when I have achieved what I am working toward, he would tell her. Right now there is too much to do. The irony was that Takeshi never specified what achievement would be enough. Each time he reached a goal, he immediately set a new one. The moment of success never brought the satisfaction he expected. Instead of pausing to enjoy what he had accomplished, he would immediately start worrying about the next challenge. One spring morning, while preparing his boat for the day's work, Takeshi slipped on wet wood and fell, hitting his head badly. When he woke up, he found himself in bed with a terrible pain in his skull and a strange disorientation. The village healer told him he had a serious concussion and must rest completely for at least a month. No work, no activity, just rest. For Takeshi, this instruction felt like a prison sentence. A month of doing nothing? A month of lost productivity? It was unbearable to contemplate. But his body gave him no choice. When he tried to get up and move around, dizziness and nausea forced him back to bed. For the first week, Takeshi was miserable. He lay in bed thinking about all the work not being done, all the opportunities being missed, all the goals slipping further away. His mind raced with plans and worries, even though his body could not move. The forced stillness felt like torture. But gradually, something began to shift. As the days passed and Takeshi had no choice but to lie still, he began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. He noticed the pattern of light moving across the wall as the sun traveled through the sky. He noticed the sounds of his village, children laughing, neighbors talking, birds singing, the river flowing. He noticed the feel of the breeze coming through the window, cool in the morning, warm in the afternoon. One day, Yumi brought him tea and sat beside his bed. Usually when she visited him, he would be too busy to really talk with her, his mind already on the next task. But now, with nowhere to go and nothing to do, he actually looked at her, really looked, and saw things he had not noticed in years. The small lines around her eyes that showed where she smiled, the gentle way she moved, the patience in her voice. Yumi, he said, surprising himself, have you always been this beautiful? She laughed. I have been the same person I always was. You just have not stopped long enough to see me in a very long time. Her words struck something deep in him. How much had he missed in his constant rushing toward the future? His wife's face, the beauty of his village, the simple pleasure of a quiet moment. He had been so focused on achieving his goals that he had forgotten to actually live. As his recovery continued, Takeshi began to practice something new. Instead of letting his mind race ahead to worries about the future, he would gently bring his attention back to what was actually present. The warmth of the sun, the taste of food, the sound of rain on the roof. Each time his mind started planning or worrying, he would notice it and return to simply being aware of this moment. It was harder than he expected. His mind had decades of practice running into the future. It did not want to stay present. But gradually, with patient practice, he found he could rest in awareness of what was actually here for longer and longer periods. And in those moments of presence, something extraordinary happened. He felt peaceful in a way he never had before. Not because circumstances were perfect. He was still injured, still unable to work, still facing uncertainty. But because he was not fighting against this moment, not wishing it were different, not waiting for some future moment to finally be happy. He was simply here, and being fully here was enough. When Takeshi was finally well enough to return to work, he did so differently. He still fished, still worked hard, still had goals, but he was no longer imprisoned by his ambition. He could pause to feel the sun on his face. He could notice the beauty of fish swimming in his nets. He could actually be present with his apprentices instead of just barking orders at them. One morning, as he and his apprentices prepared the boat, one of them, a young man named Haru, said something that used to irritate Takeshi. "Master, look at that sunrise. Have you ever seen such colors?" The old Takeshi would have snapped, "Stop wasting time. We have work to do." But the transformed Takeshi stopped and looked. The sky was indeed extraordinary, layered with shades of orange and pink and gold that seemed to pulse with life. He stood watching it with complete attention, and his apprentices joined him in silence. After several minutes, as the colors began to fade, Takeshi turned to Haru. "Thank you for calling my attention to that. For most of my life, I was too busy achieving goals to notice beauty. I was always somewhere else in my mind, never here for what was actually happening." He looked at all his apprentices gathered around him. "Let me teach you something more valuable than efficient fishing techniques. I can teach you how to be fully present for your life while you live it, not just to think about it or plan it or remember it, but to actually be here for it as it happens." From that day forward, Takeshi's teaching included not just technical skills, but practice in presence. He would sometimes stop work in the middle of the day and have everyone simply sit and feel the rocking of the boat, listen to the water, notice their breath. At first, the apprentices thought this was strange, but gradually they began to understand what he was teaching them. Years later, Haru, who had become a skilled fisherman himself, was asked what he learned from Master Takeshi. "He taught me fishing," Haru said, "but more importantly, he taught me how to be alive. He showed me that the present moment is not just a stepping stone to some future goal. It is where life actually happens. And if we miss this moment, because we are always thinking about the next one, we miss our whole life." Someone asked, "But did you not still need to plan and work toward goals?" "Of course," Haru replied. "But there is a difference between planning that comes from presence and planning that is an escape from presence. When you are here now, you can make wise choices about the future. But when you are always in the future, never actually here, you exhaust yourself and never find the peace you are seeking." This story shows us the teaching of presence through Takeshi's transformation. Before his accident, he lived entirely in the future. Each moment was just something to get through on the way to the next goal. He was physically present in his boat, in his village, with his wife. But mentally, he was always somewhere else. This pattern is so common that we barely notice it. We eat while thinking about the next task. We talk with people while planning what we will say next. We work toward weekends, vacations, retirement, always believing that some future moment will be when we can finally relax and be happy. But Takeshi's forced stillness taught him something crucial. The future never arrives as a place where we can rest. When we get to the weekend, we immediately start thinking about what comes after it. When we reach a goal, we set another. The mind has endless capacity to postpone presence, to say, "I will be here later after I accomplish this one more thing." The only way to break this pattern is to practice being here now, not waiting for perfect circumstances, not demanding that this moment be different, simply being aware of what is actually present. The warmth of sunlight, the sound of breathing, the feeling of being alive. This practice is simple, but not easy. The mind resists staying present because presence is so simple, it seems boring compared to the excitement of planning and achieving. But But when we actually settle into presence, we discover something the thinking mind misses. This moment, met with full awareness, is complete in itself. It does not need anything added to it. It is already enough. Let your shoulders soften as you receive these words. Notice that you are already here, already present, already aware. Nothing needs to change for this to be true. Takeshi's discovery that presence brings more satisfaction than achievement does not mean we stop working or planning. It means we learn to work and plan from a place of presence rather than escape. When we are here now, we can make wiser choices about the future. But when we are always escaping into thoughts about the future, we lose touch with the wisdom that comes from actually experiencing life. Let me share another story that explores how presence transforms not just our inner experience, but our relationships with others. In a town known for its tea houses, there lived a tea master named Sachiko, who was famous for the elaborate ceremonies she performed. People would travel from distant cities to attend her tea ceremonies, which were perfect in every detail. Each movement was precise. Each element was carefully chosen. Every ceremony she performed was a flawless work of art. Sachiko had devoted her entire life to perfecting the art of tea. She had studied with the greatest masters. She owned the finest utensils, some of them priceless antiques passed down through generations. Her tea room was designed with exquisite taste, every element contributing to an atmosphere of refined beauty. But Sachiko had a problem that troubled her deeply, though she told no one. Despite the perfection of her ceremonies, despite the admiration she received, she found no joy in her work anymore. The tea ceremony had become a performance she executed flawlessly, but mechanically. Her mind was always several steps ahead, planning the next movement, worrying about potential mistakes, thinking about how her performance would be judged. She went through the motions with technical precision, but she had lost the connection to the present moment that had originally drawn her to tea ceremony. She was so focused on perfection that she was no longer actually present for the experience itself. One day, a humble-looking elderly woman named Uma requested a private tea ceremony. Sachiko almost refused, as she usually only performed for groups of wealthy patrons who could afford her high fees. But something about Ume's gentle manner made her agree. On the day of the ceremony, Sachiko prepared everything with her usual meticulous care. Every detail was perfect. She greeted Ume formally and began the ceremony, moving through each step with practiced precision. But as the ceremony progressed, Sachiko noticed something strange. Ume was not watching her performance with the usual admiration or careful attention to proper etiquette. Instead, the old woman seemed completely absorbed in simple sensory experience. She would hold the tea bowl and simply feel its warmth in her hands. She would smell the tea with obvious pleasure. When she finally drank, she closed her eyes and savored each sip as if it were the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Sachiko found herself becoming irritated. She had performed a flawless ceremony, but her guest seemed more interested in the simple sensations than in appreciating the technical mastery on display. When the ceremony ended, instead of offering the usual elaborate compliments, Uma simply said, "That was lovely. Thank you." Sachiko could not help herself. "You seem to have enjoyed the tea itself more than the ceremony," she said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. Ume looked at her with clear eyes. Should they be different things? Is the ceremony not meant to help us be fully present for the experience of tea? Well, yes, Sachiko said, but the ceremony is also an art form, a demonstration of skill and aesthetic refinement. Ume nodded gently. May I be honest with you? Sachiko gestured for her to continue, curious despite her defensiveness. Your ceremony was technically perfect. Ume said, every movement was correct, every element was beautiful, but I could feel that you were not actually here. Your body was performing the ceremony, but your mind was somewhere else. perhaps thinking about the next step, perhaps worried about making a mistake. I am not sure where you were, but you were not present with the tea, with me, with this moment. Sachiko felt as if she had been struck. The observation was so accurate, so precisely targeted at the very problem she had been struggling with, that tears came to her eyes. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because I used to be the same way," Ume said softly. "I spent 40 years as a tea master, performing perfect ceremonies while being completely absent from them. My mind was always judging my performance, comparing it to others, worrying about my reputation. I knew every rule perfectly, but I had forgotten why the rules existed." "What changed?" Sachiko asked. Ume smiled. "My tea house burned down. I lost everything, all my precious utensils, my carefully designed tea room, my reputation. For a year, I was too devastated to even think about tea. But then one day, a friend simply offered me tea in a rough clay cup. Nothing special, no ceremony, just tea. And I tasted it, really tasted it, for the first time in decades. I felt the warmth, smelled the aroma, experienced the simple pleasure of drinking tea. And I realized what I had lost in my pursuit of perfection." She paused, looking at Sachiko with compassion. "The ceremony is meant to help us be present, to slow down enough to actually experience each moment fully. But we can become so focused on performing the ceremony correctly that we miss the experience it is meant to create." Over the following weeks, Ume visited Sachiko regularly, not for formal ceremonies, but for simple tea drinking. She taught Sachiko something that all her years of formal training had never addressed: how to be present. "Before you move to the next step," Ume would say, "actually complete this step. Feel the water as you pour it. Smell the tea as you prepare it. Do not rush ahead in your mind to what comes next. Be here for what is happening now." This was much harder than Sachiko expected. Her mind had decades of practice being several steps ahead, planning, anticipating, judging. Learning to actually be here, fully present for each moment of the ceremony, required patience and gentle persistence. But gradually, something began to change. When Sachiko practiced being present for each moment, rather than rushing through a mental checklist, the ceremony became alive again. She started to notice things she had overlooked in her pursuit of perfection: the sound of water, the steam rising from the kettle, the play of light on the tea bowl. Each moment held richness she had been missing. More importantly, she began to actually connect with her guests. When she was fully present, she could sense their energy, respond to their mood, create genuine relationship rather than just performing for an audience. One day, several months after meeting Ume, Sachiko performed a ceremony for a group of patrons. Afterward, one of them, a man who had attended many of her previous ceremonies, approached her with a puzzled expression. "Master Sachiko," he said, "something was different today. Your technique was perfect as always, but there was something else. I felt included somehow, as if you were not just performing for us, but actually sharing tea with us. I've never felt so moved by a tea ceremony before." Sachiko bowed with genuine humility. "Thank you. I have been learning to be present." The man looked confused. "But you have been a tea master for many years? Surely you have always been present?" Sachiko smiled. "I have been performing tea ceremony for many years, but I am only now learning to actually be here for it, to experience each moment rather than just execute it. The technical skill is important, but it means nothing if we are not present for what we are doing." Years later, Sachiko took on students of her own, and her teaching was different from the traditional approach she had received. Yes, she taught proper technique and attention to detail, but she also taught presence. She would sometimes stop a student in the middle of a ceremony and ask, "Where are you right now? Are you present for this moment, or are you thinking about the next step? Her most important teaching was simple. The ceremony can be performed perfectly with no one actually present for it, or it can be performed imperfectly with everyone fully here, fully alive, fully experiencing each moment. The second is always more valuable than the first. When asked to describe her transformation, Sachiko would say, "I thought mastery was about perfect execution, but I learned that true mastery is about being so present that each movement arises naturally from awareness rather than from mental planning. When we are fully here, the ceremony performs itself through us. When we are lost in thinking about it, we are performing a memory of a ceremony, not actually experiencing the ceremony happening now." This story reveals another dimension of the teaching about presence. Sachiko had achieved technical perfection, but her perfection had become a barrier to actual experience. She was so focused on executing the ceremony correctly that she was not present for the ceremony itself. This is a subtle trap that many of us fall into. We become so focused on doing things right, on meeting our own standards or others' expectations, that we lose contact with the actual experience of living. We perform our lives rather than being present for them. Ume's teaching was not about abandoning technical skill or attention to detail. Sachiko's years of training had value, but that skill only became truly masterful when it was united with presence. When she learned to be fully here for each moment, rather than mentally rushing ahead, her technique became alive, responsive, connected. The teaching of presence is not asking us to stop planning or to become so absorbed in the moment that we lose all sense of the future. It is asking us to recognize where we actually are right now and to bring our full attention to this moment, this breath, this experience that is actually happening. When we are present, we can still plan wisely for the future. But our planning comes from groundedness in what is actually true now, not from escape into mental fantasy. When we are present, we can still learn from the past, but our learning is not just intellectual memory. It is embodied wisdom that informs how we meet this moment. Notice the quality of awareness right now. It is simply here, simply noticing these words, simply present. This awareness does not require effort or practice. It is the nature of being conscious. What requires practice is learning to rest in this awareness rather than getting lost in the stream of thoughts about past and future. The awareness itself is always present. We are simply learning to recognize it and remain with it rather than being constantly pulled away by the thinking mind. Both Takeshi and Sachiko discovered that presence transforms everything. Not by changing external circumstances, but by changing our relationship to experience. When Takeshi was fully present, even lying in bed recovering from injury became rich with experience. When Sachiko was fully present, even the most familiar aspects of tea ceremony became fresh and alive. This is the fourth great teaching of resting in awareness. This moment is the only moment that actually exists. Everything else is mental content arising in this moment. When we learn to be here, fully and completely, we discover that we have been looking for peace in the future when it was available all along in the simple present. The ancient teachings speak of another principle that seems paradoxical at first, but holds great wisdom. They teach us that clinging creates suffering, and that learning to hold life lightly brings freedom. This does not mean we stop caring about things or stop having preferences. It means we learn the difference between caring and grasping, between preference and desperate attachment. We suffer not from loving things, but from needing to possess them, from demanding they remain exactly as they are, from building our sense of safety around holding tightly, to what we fear losing. When we can appreciate beauty without needing to own it, enjoy experiences without clinging to them, love people without trying to control them, we discover a freedom that is available even in the midst of great caring. Let me share a story about someone who learned this truth through a letting go they never chose, but which ultimately freed them. In the foothills of a great mountain range, there lived a musician named Kaido who played the shakuhachi flute. He had inherited his instrument from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. The flute was old and precious, made from a rare bamboo by a master craftsman generations ago. Its tone was said to be the purest anyone had ever heard. Kaido's entire life revolved around this flute. He practiced for hours every day, developing extraordinary skill. He performed at temples and festivals, and people would weep when they heard the haunting beauty of his playing. But over the years, his relationship with the flute had become complicated. He no longer simply loved playing music. He had become obsessively attached to this particular instrument. He would not let anyone else touch it. He kept it in a special box and checked on it multiple times each day. He worried constantly about it being damaged or stolen. When he traveled to perform, he carried it with excessive care, always anxious about potential harm. His wife, Naomi, watched this attachment grow with concern. "Kaido," she would say gently, "the flute is meant to make music, not to make you anxious. You spend more time worrying about it than enjoying it." But Kaido could not imagine being separated from his precious instrument. His identity had become merged with it. He was not just Kaito. He was Kaido, master of the ancient flute. Without it, who would he be? One autumn, Kaido traveled to a distant city to perform at an important festival. He stayed at a simple inn, and as always, he kept his flute with him constantly, even sleeping with it nearby. But one night, while he slept, thieves broke into his room. They took everything of value, including the precious flute. When Kaido woke and discovered the theft, he felt as if his life had ended. He searched frantically, reported the theft to authorities, offered rewards, but the flute was gone, probably already sold to a collector far away. He would never see it again. For weeks, Kaido was inconsolable. He returned home but could not bring himself to play music. He had other flutes, but they felt wrong in his hands. They did not sound the same. Nothing could replace what he had lost. He sank into deep depression, feeling that his purpose in life had been stolen along with his instrument. Naomi watched her husband suffering, and she hurt for him. But she also saw something he could not yet see. His attachment to the flute had been a kind of prison. He had stopped experiencing joy in music and had instead become consumed with protecting a possession. One day, after Kaido had spent weeks doing nothing but mourning his loss, Naomi brought home a simple bamboo flute. It was rough and ordinary, made by a local craftsman for very little money, nothing like the precious instrument he had lost. "Play this," she said simply, offering it to him. Kaido looked at the crude instrument with disdain. "That is not a real flute. It is nothing compared to what I had." "Play it anyway," she insisted. Reluctantly, to please his wife, Kaido lifted the simple flute to his lips and blew. The sound was rough, nowhere near the pure tone of his lost treasure. But as he continued playing, something unexpected happened. Without the perfect instrument to rely on, he had to use all his skill, all his breath control, all his musicianship to coax beauty from this simple piece of bamboo. And slowly, gradually, he began to find it. Not the same beauty as before, but a different kind. Raw, honest, earned through skill rather than possessed through a precious instrument. Naomi sat listening, and when he finished the simple melody, she had tears in her eyes. "That was beautiful," she said. "Perhaps even more beautiful than before, because I could hear you in it, not just the famous flute." Her words struck something deep in Kaido. He realized that for years he had been hiding behind his precious instrument. People had praised his playing, But how much of that praise was for his skill, and how much was simply awe at the rare flute? He had built his entire identity around possessing something special rather than being someone skilled. Over the following months, Keiko began to practice with simple flutes. Some were better than others, but none were precious antiques. And something remarkable happened. Without a precious instrument to protect and worry about, he could focus purely on the music itself. He could experiment, take risks, try new things. If a flute broke or was lost, it could be replaced. Nothing was irreplaceable. His playing developed in new ways. He had always been technically skilled, but now a new quality emerged, a freedom, a willingness to be vulnerable, to let the music flow without the armor of a perfect instrument protecting him. One day, a traveling merchant came through the village and heard Keiko playing. Afterward, he approached with excitement. "Master musician," the merchant said, "I must tell you something. 3 years ago, I purchased a very old, very rare shakuhachi flute from a peddler in a distant city. I have been looking for someone skilled enough to play it properly. Would you be willing to try?" Kaito's heart stopped. Could it be? When the merchant brought out the instrument, Keiko recognized it immediately. His grandfather's flute. The precious instrument that had been stolen, it had found its way back to him. He held it in his hands, feeling its familiar weight, seeing the worn places his fingers had created over years of playing. The merchant watched eagerly, waiting to hear the famous tone that made this flute so valuable. But Keiko did not immediately play. He looked at this instrument that had once been his whole identity, and he felt something surprising. Yes, there was joy at seeing it again. But there was also clarity. He was no longer the person who needed this flute to be complete. He had discovered that his musicianship lived in him, not in any instrument. He lifted the flute to his lips and played. The tone was just as pure as he remembered, just as beautiful. When he finished, the merchant was ecstatic. "I knew it," he said. "This flute is legendary. I will sell it to you for a very fair price, as you clearly know its true value." Keiko smiled and handed the flute back. "It is a beautiful instrument," he said, "but I do not need to own it. I have learned that music does not live in flutes. It lives in the breath in the heart, in the skill of the musician. This flute will make beautiful sounds whoever plays it, but my music is mine, regardless of what instrument I hold." The merchant looked shocked. "But surely you want your family heirloom back? Surely you want this rare treasure?" "I appreciate the offer," Keiko said genuinely, "but I am already complete. I do not need to possess anything to be who I am." As the merchant left, carrying the precious flute with him, Naomi came to stand beside her husband. "Are you certain?" she asked. "You could have bought it back? You could have owned it again." Keiko put his arm around her. "The theft of that flute was the greatest gift I ever received," he said. "It forced me to discover that I had made my identity, my peace, my sense of worth dependent on a possession. Losing it broke me open. But through that breaking, I discovered something that can never be stolen, the music that lives in me, not in any instrument." He picked up one of his simple bamboo flutes. "This is enough," he said. "Any flute is enough, because I am enough. I finally understand the difference between loving something and needing to possess it. I can appreciate beauty without grasping it. I can create music without clinging to perfect conditions, and that freedom is worth more than the most precious flute ever crafted." Years later, Keiko became known not for owning a rare instrument, but for the extraordinary quality of presence he brought to his music. He would play on whatever flute was available, and somehow each one sounded beautiful in his skilled hands. Students would ask him the secret of his musicianship, and he would say, "Learn your craft so well that you do not depend on perfect conditions. Develop such skill that you can create the beauty with whatever you have. And most importantly, never make your peace dependent on possessing any particular thing. Hold everything lightly, and paradoxically, you will enjoy it more fully. This story shows us the teaching of non-attachment through Kaido's transformation. His attachment to the precious flute had created constant anxiety. He could not simply enjoy playing because he was always worried about protecting his treasure. The instrument that should have brought joy had become a source of suffering. When the flute was stolen, Kaido initially experienced complete devastation. His identity had been so merged with the instrument that losing it felt like losing himself. But this devastating loss ultimately freed him. It forced him to discover that his musicianship was not in the flute. It was in him. This is what the teaching of non-attachment is pointing toward. When we make our peace, our identity, our sense of worth dependent on external things, we create fragility. We live in constant fear of loss. We cannot fully enjoy what we have because we are too busy worrying about keeping it. But when we develop such inner resources, such genuine skill and presence, that we can meet any circumstance with creativity and grace, we discover a freedom that does not depend on conditions. We can still appreciate beautiful things, but we are not imprisoned by our need to possess them. Notice how you are being supported right now without holding on to anything. The air you breathe comes and goes. Life sustains you through constant flow, not through your desperate grasping. Kaido's choice when he encountered his precious flute again shows the full flowering of non-attachment. He could have bought it back. Part of him wanted to. But he recognized that doing so would be stepping back into the prison he had escaped. He had learned to be free, and no instrument, however precious, was worth giving up that freedom. This does not mean we should not have possessions or should not care about things. It means we hold them lightly enough that losing them does not destroy us. We enjoy them fully while we have them and release them gracefully when circumstances change. The teaching of letting go is ultimately a teaching of freedom. When we are not desperately attached to particular outcomes or possessions, when we can hold life's gifts with open hands rather than closed fists, we discover a peace that external circumstances cannot touch. We can fully engage with life while remaining free. Let me share one more story that explores how this teaching of non-attachment applies not just to possessions, but to our ideas, our plans, and even our understanding of how life should unfold. In a coastal village, there lived a master carpenter named Hiroshi, who was famous throughout the region for his ability to design and build houses. He could look at a piece of land and immediately envision the perfect structure for that location, accounting for sun, wind, water flow, and the needs of the family who would live there. His designs were both beautiful and practical, and houses he built were treasured for generations. Hiroshi took great pride in his vision. When he designed a house, he knew exactly how it should be built. He would create detailed plans, and he expected everyone working with him to follow those plans precisely. He had little patience for suggestions or alterations. In his mind, he had seen the perfect form, and any deviation from his vision would diminish the final result. One year, a wealthy merchant named Tanaka commissioned Hiroshi to design and build a house on a beautiful hillside overlooking the ocean. It would be Hiroshi's most ambitious project, and he poured months of work into creating what he believed would be his masterpiece. The design was magnificent. The main room would have enormous windows facing the ocean, capturing the view and the light. A garden would flow around the house, creating harmony between building and nature. Every detail was carefully planned, from the placement of support beams to the flow of space through the rooms. When construction began, Hiroshi oversaw every aspect personally. He was determined that this house would be built exactly according to his vision. But then, unexpected complications began to arise. The first problem came when workers discovered that the ground beneath where Hiroshi had planned the foundation was not as stable as initial surveys had suggested. Building exactly according to his plans would risk structural problems. The construction foreman suggested moving the house 15 feet to the east, where the ground was more solid. But this would change everything about Hiroshi's design. The windows would no longer catch the light in the same way. The relationship between house and garden would be different. His perfect vision would be compromised. Hiroshi refused the suggestion. "We will reinforce the foundation," he said. "The house must be built where I designed it." This required additional time and considerable expense, but Hiroshi insisted. His vision had to be realized exactly as he had conceived it. The next problem came when the large windows he had specified for the ocean view arrived broken from the glassmaker. The glassmaker apologized profusely and explained that windows of that size were extremely difficult to create. He could remake them, but it would take 4 months. Or he could provide slightly smaller windows immediately. Again, the construction foreman suggested an alternative. "Master Hiroshi, what if we used a series of smaller windows instead? We could create a wall of windows that would actually provide an even better view and more light than the single large windows you designed." But Hiroshi would not hear of it. "No, the design calls for large windows. We will wait for the glassmaker to create them properly." This delay meant construction stopped for months, with workers sitting idle and costs mounting. Tanaka, the merchant who had commissioned the house, began to grow concerned about both the delays and the rising expenses, but Hiroshi assured him that perfection required patience. The third problem was the most significant. As the house began to take shape, it became clear that Hiroshi's design, while beautiful, had a flaw he had not anticipated. The large south-facing windows that would provide such magnificent views would also make the house unbearably hot in summer. The coastal winds that he had thought would cool the house were blocked by a grove of trees that had grown taller than he had accounted for. The foreman, who had decades of experience building in this region, gently pointed out the problem. "Master Hiroshi, I have built many houses along this coast. This design will be uncomfortable to live in during the summer months. We could adjust the window placement, add eaves for shade, modify the design to account for the heat. The house would still be beautiful, but it would also be livable." But Hiroshi felt personally offended by this suggestion. His design was perfect. Any problems would be solved by the occupants adapting to the house, not by changing his vision to accommodate practical concerns. When the house was finally completed, nearly a year behind schedule and far over budget, it was undeniably beautiful. Hiroshi stood before his creation with pride. He had realized his vision exactly as he had conceived it. Every detail was precisely as he had planned. Tanaka and his family moved in, and for the first few weeks, they marveled at the beauty of their new home. The ocean view was magnificent. The space flowed beautifully. It was everything Hiroshi had promised. But as summer arrived, the house became almost uninhabitable. The southern rooms were like ovens. The family could not use large portions of the house during the day. They had to cover Hiroshi's carefully designed windows with heavy curtains, blocking the very views the house had been designed to showcase. Tanaka approached Hiroshi with respect, but also frustration. "Master, the house is beautiful, but we cannot live comfortably in it. Would you be willing to make some modifications? Perhaps we could add some shade structures or adjust the windows?" But Hiroshi was offended. "The house is exactly as it should be. If you are uncomfortable, perhaps you need to adjust your habits. My design is perfect." Tanaka was troubled by this response, but he was not an angry man. Instead of arguing, he hired another carpenter, a younger man named Koji, to make some practical modifications to the house. Koji added exterior shutters that could be adjusted to control light and heat. He built a covered porch that provided shade. He made small changes that honored Hiroshi's basic design while making the house actually livable. When Hiroshi heard that modifications had been made to his house without his permission, he was furious. He went to see what had been done, ready to denounce the changes and demand they be undone. But when he arrived, he found Tanaka and his family sitting comfortably in the main room that had previously been unusable in summer. The shutters Koji had installed allowed them to control the light and heat. The covered porch created a cool outdoor space. The family was happy, using and enjoying all parts of the house. Tanaka welcomed Hiroshi warmly, showing no resentment for the difficulties the original design had created. "Master Hiroshi," he said, "your vision created something beautiful. Koji's modifications made it livable. Together, you have created a house that is both beautiful and functional. I am grateful to both of you." Hiroshi looked at the modifications, and something in him resisted admitting that they were improvements. His pride told him that any change to his vision was a diminishment. But he could not deny that the family was now comfortable, that the house was being used as a home should be used, that beauty without functionality was incomplete. Koji, the young carpenter who had made the modifications, approached Hiroshi with great respect. "Master," he said, "I hope you are not offended by the changes. I studied your design carefully before adding anything. I tried to honor your vision while addressing the practical problems. I see myself as completing what you began, not as correcting your work." Hiroshi looked at this young carpenter, and he saw something that troubled him. He saw a flexibility and humility that he himself lacked. Koji did not need to prove his perfection. He was willing to adapt, to respond to actual conditions rather than insist on predetermined plans. That night, Hiroshi could not sleep. He kept thinking about his refusal to modify his design, about the delays and expenses caused by his insistence on perfection, about the months Tanaka's family had lived uncomfortably because he would not admit his design had flaws. He realized that his attachment to his vision had blinded him. He had become so focused on realizing his plan exactly as conceived that he had lost sight of the purpose, to create a home where a family could live comfortably and happily. His identity as a master carpenter who never made mistakes had become more important to him than creating something truly valuable. His attachment to being right had made him unable to see when he was actually wrong. The next morning, Hiroshi returned to Tanaka's house. He found Koji working on a final detail and asked if they could speak. The young carpenter listened as the famous master made an admission that did not come easily. "I have been building houses for 40 years, Hiroshi said, "and I have always believed that the mark of a master is having a clear vision and never deviating from it. But you have shown me something I had forgotten. The mark of a true master is not rigid adherence to a plan. It is the wisdom to respond to what actually is, rather than insisting on what you thought should be." He looked at the modifications Koji had made. "Your additions have made this a better house. I should have listened when problems emerged during construction. I should have been willing to adapt my design to actual conditions. My attachment to my own vision prevented me from seeing what was needed." Koji bowed respectfully. "Master, every builder learns from experience. I have made many mistakes in my career. I just happened to have learned from similar mistakes before working on this house." Hiroshi shook his head. "It is not about mistakes. It is about attachment. I was so attached to my idea of how the house should be that I could not see how it actually was. I valued my vision more than the well-being of the people who would live here." From that day forward, Hiroshi's approach to his work changed. He still created beautiful designs, but he held them more lightly. When conditions suggested modifications, he was willing to adapt. When workers offered insights based on their experience, he listened. When his initial vision proved flawed, he could acknowledge it and adjust. His later works were considered his finest, not because they were more beautiful than his earlier designs, but because they combined beauty with wisdom, vision with flexibility. He learned to serve the needs of the people who would live in his buildings rather than demanding that they serve his need to be proven right. Years later, when students of carpentry would ask Hiroshi about his most important lesson, he would take them to see Tanaka's house. "This building taught me the difference between attachment and dedication," he would say. "I thought I was dedicated to creating something perfect, but I was actually attached to proving my vision was flawless. Dedication serves the purpose of the work. Attachment serves the ego of the worker." Learning to tell the difference is perhaps the most important skill any craftsman can develop. This story reveals how attachment extends beyond possessions to include our ideas, our plans, our need to be right. Hiroshi was not attached to an object, but to his vision, his identity as someone who never made mistakes, his need to prove his designs were perfect. This kind of attachment is perhaps even more subtle and imprisoning than attachment to possessions. We can recognize when we are grasping material things, but we often do not notice when we are grasping our ideas, our self-image, our need to have reality conform to our expectations. Hiroshi's refusal to adapt his design when problems emerged caused real harm. The construction delays cost time and money. The uncomfortable house diminished the family's quality of life. All of this suffering came from his attachment to being right, to realizing his vision exactly as conceived, to maintaining his identity as a master who never needed to change his plans. Koji's flexibility showed what freedom from attachment looks like. He could honor Hiroshi's original vision while adapting it to actual conditions. He did not need to prove he was right or protect his ego. He simply wanted to create something that worked, something that served its purpose. When Hiroshi finally released his attachment to his perfect vision, his work actually improved. By holding his designs more lightly, by remaining open to adaptation and input, he created buildings that were both beautiful and wise. His dedication to his craft remained, but his attachment to his ego dissolved. This teaching applies to every aspect of life. How often do we cling to plans that are not working? How often do we refuse to adapt because admitting we need to change feels like admitting we were wrong? How often does our attachment to being right prevent us from seeing what is actually true? The practice of non-attachment does not mean we stop having visions or making plans. It means we hold them lightly enough to adapt when reality shows us something we did not anticipate. It means we value truth more than being proven right. It means we serve the purpose of our work more than we serve our ego. Notice any tightness in your body right now. Can you breathe into it and let it soften? This is the practice of letting go in its most immediate form. Both Kaido and Hiroshi discovered that what they thought they needed to grasp tightly was actually limiting them. Kaido's attachment to his precious flute kept him from discovering the freedom of his own musicianship. Hiroshi's attachment to his perfect vision kept him from creating truly wise designs. When each learned to let go, they discovered they had not lost anything real. They had only released the prison of their own grasping. This is the fifth great teaching of resting in awareness. Life flows, circumstances change, plans need adaptation. When we can hold everything lightly, when we can care deeply without grasping desperately, when we can love without trying to possess, we discover a freedom that is available in every moment. Not freedom from engagement with life, but freedom within engagement. Not detachment, but the ability to remain open and responsive, regardless of what appears. The ancient teachers emphasized one more essential understanding that ties together all these teachings. They pointed to the difference between knowing about something and actually knowing it directly through lived experience. We can read hundreds of books about peace without experiencing a moment of genuine peace. We can study teachings about presence without ever being truly present. We can understand concepts about non-attachment while remaining desperately attached to our ideas about non-attachment. This is why the teachers always emphasized practice over theory, direct experience over intellectual understanding. The teachings are like a map showing the way to a beautiful garden. The map is helpful, but studying the map for years without ever walking the path to the garden means we never actually see the flowers, never smell their fragrance, never feel the sun in that peaceful space. Let me share a final story that shows how this understanding transforms someone who has spent their life accumulating knowledge into someone who actually embodies wisdom. In a monastery, famous for its vast library, there lived a scholar monk named Ryokan who had devoted 50 years to studying Buddhist texts. He had read everything, memorized countless sutras, could recite teachings from every school and lineage. Other monks came from distant temples to consult with him when they had questions about doctrine or interpretation. Ryokan took great pride in his knowledge. He saw himself as a guardian of the teachings, preserving and understanding what the Buddha and the great masters had said. His room was filled with scrolls and books. His mind was filled with quotes and concepts, and he believed this made him one of the most accomplished monks in the land. But despite all his learning, Ryokan had a secret doubt that troubled him in quiet moments. He had studied peace for 50 years, but he did not feel peaceful. He had memorized teachings about enlightenment, but he did not feel enlightened. He had perfect intellectual understanding of non-attachment, but he was desperately attached to his identity as a great scholar. One winter, a wandering monk named Dogen arrived at the monastery seeking shelter from a storm. He was given a simple room and shown to the dining hall for evening meal. Ryokan, as the most senior scholar, sat at the head of the table and immediately began to test this newcomer. "Tell me, brother," Ryokan said, "how do you understand the teaching of emptiness?" Dogen smiled gently. "I understand it by washing my bowl after eating." Ryokan frowned, thinking this was an evasion. That is not an answer. Emptiness is a profound philosophical concept that requires careful explanation. Surely you can do better than a reference to washing dishes. "Can I?" Dogen asked. "I have found that the most profound truths are the simplest ones, lived moment by moment, rather than explained in elaborate language." Ryokan felt challenged. Over the next several days, he engaged Dogen in debate, trying to demonstrate the depth of his knowledge and the shallowness of the wanderer's simple responses. But each time Ryokan offered an elaborate explanation of some teaching, Dogen would respond with something frustratingly simple. "What is Buddha nature?" Ryokan would ask, ready to share the 17 different interpretations he had memorized. "The flower in the garden," Dogen would reply. "How does one achieve liberation?" "By being fully present for this breath." "What is the highest teaching?" "Kindness to the person in front of you." Ryokan found these answers infuriating because they were so simple they felt dismissive of the complex understanding he had worked 50 years to develop. He began to avoid Dogen, but the wandering monk's presence in the monastery troubled him. One evening, Ryokan was in the library reading a particularly difficult text about the nature of consciousness. He had read this same text dozens of times over the years, and each time he found new layers of meaning to explore. He was completely absorbed in trying to understand a particularly complex passage when Dogen happened to pass by. The wandering monk glanced at what Ryokan was reading and asked simply, "Do you understand that?" "I am working on understanding it," Ryokan replied. "It is very profound and requires deep study." "No," Dogen said. "I mean, do you understand it, or do you understand about it?" Ryokan was confused. "What is the difference?" Dogen sat down beside him. "This text you are reading describes the nature of awareness, yes?" "Yes," Ryokan confirmed. "So, right now as you read, are you aware?" "Of course." "Then you already understand the nature of awareness directly through your own immediate experience. The text is describing what you are already experiencing. You do not need to understand the text to understand awareness. You only need to notice that you are aware." Ryokan started to object, but Dogen continued gently. "You have spent 50 years studying what the Buddha said about peace, about presence, about the nature of mind. But have you spent 50 years actually being peaceful, actually being present, actually resting in the awareness the texts describe. The question landed like a stone in still water. Ryokan realized with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that the answer was no. He had spent 50 years thinking about these things, but he had not spent 50 years practicing them, embodying them, living them. The teachings are meant to be lived, Dogen said softly. They are not meant to be collected like precious objects. You have built a beautiful library in your mind, but you have not walked out into the garden they all point toward. That night, Ryokan could not sleep. He kept thinking about Dogen's words, about the difference between knowing about something and knowing it directly. He had to admit that all his study had created a kind of pride, a sense that he was more advanced than others because he knew more. But this knowing was just mental content, thoughts about reality rather than actual experience of reality. The next morning, Ryokan found Dogen in the monastery garden, simply sitting on a bench, apparently doing nothing. Ryokan sat beside him in silence. After several minutes, Dogen spoke. "What are you experiencing right now?" he asked. Ryokan thought about how to answer, then realized he was thinking about the experience rather than experiencing it. He stopped thinking and simply noticed. "I feel the cold air. I hear birds. I see the bare trees. I am aware of sitting here." "Is this not enough?" Dogen asked. Ryokan realized, with something like shock, that it was enough. This simple moment of direct experience was complete in itself. It did not need to be understood, explained, categorized, or related to anything he had read. It was just what it was, and being present for it was its own form of knowing. Over the remaining weeks of Dogen's stay, something fundamental shifted in Ryokan. He began to practice alongside study. When he read about presence, he would then put down the book and actually be present. When he studied teachings about compassion, he would then go find opportunities to be compassionate. When he encountered texts about letting go, he would practice releasing his grip on his identity as a scholar. It was humbling work. Being a beginner at actual practice after being an expert in theory required letting go of the pride he had built around his knowledge. But gradually, Ryokan began to experience what he had only understood intellectually before. Before Dogen left, Ryokan thanked him. "You have shown me that I have been confusing the menu with the meal, the map with the territory. I had thousands of descriptions of the garden but had never actually walked through it." Dogen smiled. "And now I still study," Ryokan said, "but I also practice. I still read the teachings, but I also live them. The study has new meaning now because it points toward something I am actually experiencing rather than just conceptualizing." Years later, when Ryokan's own students would come asking questions about difficult texts, his teaching style had changed completely. He would still help them understand the intellectual content, but he would always follow by saying, "Now, put down the book. Go be present for your actual life. The teaching is not in the words. The teaching is in the living." When asked about his transformation, Ryokan would say simply, "I spent 50 years becoming an expert on peace without experiencing peace. Then I learned that one moment of actual peace is worth more than 50 years of understanding about peace. Now I study to point myself toward direct experience, not to accumulate knowledge for its own sake." This story brings us full circle to where we began. All of these teachings about impermanence, about compassion, about no self, about presence, about letting go, they are not meant to be collected and hoarded like precious possessions. They are meant to be lived, practiced, embodied in our actual moment-to-moment experience. Ryokan's 50 years of study were not wasted, but they became truly valuable only when he stopped treating them as an end in themselves and started using them as pointers toward direct experience. The map is helpful, but only if we use it to find our way to the actual territory. This is why These teachings always emphasize practice. Not just thinking about being present, but actually being present. Not just understanding compassion intellectually, but actually being compassionate. Not just studying non-attachment, but actually practicing letting go. And the beautiful truth is that this practice is not complicated. It does not require years of preparation or special circumstances. It is available right now in this moment. Can you feel your breath? That is practice. Can you notice without judging? That is practice. Can you be kind to yourself in this moment? That is practice. All the wisdom that Ryokan spent 50 years studying was ultimately pointing to something very simple. Be here. Be aware. Be kind. The sophistication of the Bo teachings exists to help us when we get confused, to answer our questions, to guide us past common traps. But the essence remains beautifully simple. Feel your body right now, being supported, being breathed, being alive. This is not a metaphor or a concept. This is your actual direct experience. And in this direct experience, all the teachings are already present, not as ideas, but as living reality. This is the sixth and final teaching. Wisdom must be embodied, not just understood. Peace must be experienced, not just studied. The difference between knowing about truth and actually knowing truth is the difference between reading about a beautiful garden and actually sitting in it, feeling the sun, smelling the flowers, hearing the birds, being present for the direct experience of beauty. And this direct experience is always available. You do not need to wait until you have understood everything. You do not need perfect conditions. You simply need to stop, to notice, to be actually here for your life as it unfolds. These teachings we have explored tonight are not meant to be remembered perfectly or understood completely. They are meant to settle into you like seeds planted in fertile ground, growing in their own time, bearing fruit through your actual lived experience rather than through your accumulation of concepts. You have received something tonight, not because you have learned new information, but because you have been invited to recognize what is already true. The peace you seek is not far away. It is here in the simple awareness that knows these words, that feels the body, that experiences being alive in this moment. There is nothing more to achieve, nowhere else to go, no one else to become. The awareness resting in this moment is already complete, already whole, already at peace. All the teachings point here, to this simple recognition. You are already home. As you rest now, let everything settle. Let the body soften completely. Let the mind release its grip on understanding and simply rest in being. You have walked through ancient wisdom, through stories of transformation, through teachings that have guided countless beings toward peace. But the real teaching is not in the words. It is in the silence between the words, in the awareness that holds everything, in the simple fact of being present, being here, being aware in this moment. That is always new, always complete, always enough. May you rest deeply in this awareness. May you wake tomorrow with recognition that peace is not something to achieve, but something to rest in. May your life unfold with the grace that comes from holding everything lightly, meeting everything with presence, and resting in the awareness that has been here all along. Thank you for this journey together. Thank you for your openness and presence. Thank you for being exactly who you are, exactly as you are, in this moment that is already perfect. May you sleep peacefully, knowing that the awareness you rest in never sleeps, never wavers, never needs anything to be different. You are already home. You have always been home. Rest in this truth. Thank you for joining us here at Calm Buddha Path.